You are not going to be able to do anything as the ANC without the approval of the DA. And I'm saying that because if 60%, because this document says where consensus is not possible, the principle of sufficient consensus must apply. Sufficient consensus exists when parties representing 60% of the seats in the National Assembly agree, as you've stated. So you already have 40%, the DA has 20%. You could very well put up a position in cabinet, for instance, where the IFP agree with you, the PA, the PAC, Good Party agrees with you, but that's not enough for you to pass that. You are still going to need the approval of the Democratic Alliance for the decisions that you make.
No, consensus and sufficient consensus is a deadlock breaking mechanism where there is an issue on the table and there is no agreement. But it does not in itself hamstring the functioning of cabinet in terms of decision making. That is an understanding in terms of the statement of intent among political parties that for the goodwill and the smooth running and stability of the country, we will then look at matters from a point of view of deadlock breaking mechanism through a consensus or sufficient consensus. And sufficient consensus will only be reached after engagement, and that is it. So it is not about subjecting yourself and the DA vetoing cabinet. It is unconstitutional in a sense, unless if it is entrenched in the constitution. The state of intent determines how you function smoothly. Remember, the foundational principle overarching, among others, talks about stability, constitutionalism, and the rule of law. So we're not replacing the constitution. So in this particular instance, for the goodwill and the best and the good way of functioning of government, yes, you can come with issues and all of that, but if there is no agreement on some of the issues, then we will go through the route of sufficient consensus in terms of reaching a decision. So nobody vetoes the decisions of cabinet. Okay, cabinet will still take its own decisions. But that decision of cabinet is taken based on the consensus of the parties in the government of national unity, right? Your majority as the ANC, because you don't have that anymore, and the fact that you've got the highest number of votes and you have 40% doesn't mean that if there was a disagreement, you can still go ahead and say this is a decision of cabinet. You still need the buy-in of the other parties in the GNU. It is a deadlock breaking mechanism, and that is what I'm explaining. So it means a cabinet decision in itself cannot be vetoed by any other party. It means that political parties will debate, and the reflection of that discussion in the GNU will be taken by sufficient consensus. But how do we reach that decision? So when you say a decision by cabinet, how do we reach it? Is it when you say, all right, 60% of us agree here, so that means that qualifies as a decision of cabinet? That is the threshold we're actually talking about in terms of, it's a concession in this particular instance. And what it means is that 60% of political parties in the GNU will arrive at a decision and use sufficient consensus as a deadlock breaking mechanism should any of such arise. Yes, and that's the point I'm making, that for it to be a decision, 60%, if there's no consensus, have to agree to that. You don't have that 60% with the IFP, the Good Party, the PAC. You need the DA to rubber stamp every time that there's a deadlock. For there to be 60% consensus, you need the DA to rubber stamp that. Without their numbers, you can't have a legitimate decision that you say this is a result of sufficient consensus. No, it is incorrect. Cabinet does not function on the basis outside the realm of the constitutional prescript. And the question of goodwill in terms of functioning and smooth functioning and putting together the GNU government, it means where there are contradictions and issues that need to be resolved will be resolved by sufficient consensus. And in this particular instance, it does not mean that in the normal functioning of cabinet, from the point of view of how the executive has to function, it ceases to operate. We are talking about a concession in relation to how you break a deadlock, should there be any, where decisions have got to be taken. Okay, let's be practical as my last question, because I want us to be clear and understand you well here. If, as the
as the government of the government of national unity, you're working on a statement, you're discussing what's happening in the Middle East. You believe as the ANC that you must characterize as cabinet what's happening in the Middle East as genocide. The Democratic Alliance, with their 20% in that cabinet, say, we don't agree with that. That's a deadlock, right? So for you, for the president to come out and say, this is an approved cabinet decision, and I'm communicating it, when there has been a deadlock where the ANC says it's a genocide in the Middle East, the DA says it is not. Are you saying that even when the DA has said no with their 40%, the president can still come out and take that decision as sufficient and having been agreed by the collective, and it's still a legitimate decision that is reached to after consensus?
We are not talking about a negotiated political settlement here. We have long moved out of that. This is a GNU with special characteristics, in which we talk about the normal operation and functioning of government, which in itself is not hamstrung by the fact that for every cabinet member and decision to be taken, it will at all material times be subjected to disagreement. So the question is, should that actually arise, determined by the number of political parties that are there that participate? We have then put the question of sufficient consensus to arrive at the decision.
I agree with you, which is why in the beginning I didn't say every single cabinet decision. Of course, let's say 80% or 90% of the times you guys are going to agree. But the reality is there are policy differences, which is why I'm using the national minimum wage for a reason. I'm using the war in the Middle East for a reason, because that's where you don't see eye to eye. So in that 1 or 5% where you have fundamental differences in policy, how do you deal with it? That's
the minimum wage cannot be reversed.
Yeah, but that's it. I'm saying, what if you want to increase it by R1? The DA doesn't believe in that.
The question is, there is no party that has got the veto power within the government of national unity. So for us to agree, it means that we put a threshold not of a single party. You must understand the 60% how it operates. Start with 50%, which would have included, if it was a grand coalition, 2 parties. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we have broadened that, reflective of the parties that are in the National Assembly to participate in the GNU, you have then raised the threshold to 60%. So it means of those parties that participate, that will determine broadly a bigger decision that needs to be taken within government.
And you as the ANC with 40%, let's say you've got the IFP, the DA, the PAC, the Good Party, that still doesn't give you 50%, does it? You need the DA. That's the point I'm trying to make.
It might as well happen that the DA disagrees, but I'm saying it does not have the veto power from not saying the decision cannot be taken. The threshold of 60% is of all the parties which will be participating.
And I'm saying you don't have the threshold of 60%. Put the DA aside. Take you, IFP, PAC, Good Party, PA. You don't have 50%. There's not much you can do on your own. At the end of the day, you are going to need the DA, even if it's just 10 members of the DA. You're going to need them in order to deal with any deadlock that you may have.
When you constitute government and you talk about 60% and political parties broadly that participate, the determination of the decisions, how they are taken in terms of cabinet, at the end of the day, should there be any other deadlock with regard to the executive, the deadlock breaking mechanism at your disposal is to negotiate and engage in a sufficient consensus. But it does not apply in terms of decision making such that a party can have a veto power over the executive decision making process. The question that must be interrogated, which is what I think you are in a hurry to make a determination about the DA having veto powers, is that a single political party cannot stop the operations of the executive in this unless institutionalized and reflected in the constitution of the country that that veto power, it is acceptable.
And the executive is the government of national unity, it's not the ANC, right?
The government of national unity is of all parties that participate.
Which is why you need an agreement. So as the ANC, when you say you can't stop the operations of the executive is not the ANC. The executive is the government of national unity. That's why those people need to agree. At the very least, 60% of them must agree. So but let's move on from it. I'm going to bring in Helen Zille, because Helen Zille actually told me that the ANC is not going to be able to do anything without 60%. They have 20%, you have 40%. The document you have signed says if there's a deadlock, at least 60% of parties must agree. And unfortunately for you as the ANC, the IFP, the Good Party, the PA, all the other smaller parties don't give you 60%. At the end of the day, you need the DA to come and rubber stamp whatever decision you're going to make. That's what's according to the document you've signed.
No, I think the interpretation of the decision, also in terms of our discussion, is what need to be clarified.
Okay.
And that is what is important.
All right. We'll hear from Helen Zille in a moment about how they interpret that. Zoom, Helen, thank you so much for making time for us this evening. And you've been waiting long because I was trying to get Fikile Mbalula, who is the Secretary-General of the ANC, to understand a very crucial clause in this document that all of you have signed in this Government of National Unity. And that's where I want to start with you. The deadlock requires that there's sufficient consensus. When there's a deadlock reached, sufficient consensus means 60% of the parties that represent seats in the National Assembly have got to agree. Fikile Mbalula doesn't necessarily seem so. How do you interpret it as someone who was negotiating?
Clement, it's not parties with 60% of seats in the National Assembly. It's 60% of seats in the Government of National Unity. Mm-hmm. And so I interpret it the way you interpret it with Fikile when you were talking to him. It is all the parties who are in the Government of National Unity must reach consensus. Alternatively, 60% must.
Yeah.
Not 60% of parties, but 60% of parties. Let me just quickly read it to you. Parties to the GNU representing 60% of seats in the National Assembly. So they've got to be, first of all, be parties to the Government of National Unity.
Yeah.
And then those parties have to represent 60% of the seats in the National Assembly. That is, the Government of National Unity has to comprise 60% of the seats that the Government of National Unity parties have in the Assembly.
In practical terms, what that means is the ANC can't just come up with a position and then they say to the IFP, oh, vote with us here in cabinet, or for us to decide a government position, or let's bring in the Good Party as well. Ultimately, they're still going to need the DA because you are bringing in about 20% of support, and you carry weight in that Government of National Unity. Is there ever going to be a point where the ANC is able to pass through a resolution, let's say in cabinet or about the executive, without you giving it the green light as the Democratic Alliance?
Clement, we will represent at least 30% of the seats in the Government of National Unity, not 20, 30. The ANC will represent at least 60% of the Government of National Unity, but you have to do it looking at all the parties that are going to be in the Government of National Unity.
Yeah.
And it's only the parties in the Government of National Unity, so we're going to have 30% of, for example, all the seats if they do it by proportional representation and take the electoral results into account, which we've got there. But you're absolutely right. Without the Democratic Alliance, the ANC can't reach 60% of the seats in the National Assembly occupied by the Government of National Unity parties. It's complex, but you are right.
And if the ANC then brings in parties like the IFP and the Good Party and the PA and the PAC, who have now signed this document as well, do they reach that 60%?
No, let me say this, that the ANC can't bring people in that they feel like bringing in. This is another thing that Fikile doesn't seem to understand, because it says that in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive GNU, it is agreed that the composition shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties decide to be part of the GNU. Now, agreed means by sufficient consensus. So it's not the ANC that gets to invite everybody, as Fikile seems to think. He keeps on actually making public statements about this one's joined and that one's joined, but he must read clause 24 of the document that he signed.
Hold on. So are you saying to me that even when the PA decides to join, the ANC has had to consult you and the other parties in the Government of National Unity before accepting any other party to come and join and sign that document?
Absolutely. There are three founding members of this. It is ourselves, it is the ANC, and it is the IFP. And clause 24 says, in keeping with the spirit of an inclusive GNU, it is agreed that the composition shall be discussed and agreed amongst the existing parties whenever new parties desire to be part of the Government of National Unity. That's what it says in clause 24.
So were you consulted about the PA or the PAC?
We were consulted about the PAC, but not the PA. The PAC was raised in the negotiations. The PAC, Good, and the UDM were raised during the negotiations, but definitely not the PA. But, it's not about the PA per se, it's about the principle of this issue. They haven't consulted us, and the ANC must realize that they don't take all the decisions anymore. They didn't win the election.
So what does that mean now? Will you be taking it up with the African National Congress?
I have. I've written to Fikile Mbalula. I wish we'd been on together. I would have had a little bit of a debate with him. But I wrote him a letter yesterday. I got an acknowledgement of receipt. And basically I referred to clause 24. I said, you can't do this. And then I referred to clause 19, the sufficient consensus clause. So he says he'll get back to me, but I'm still waiting for that.
Okay. So when it comes to the constitution of government then, what happens if President Cyril Ramaphosa, for instance, gives the PA one or two ministries? Is that something that would dissatisfy you as a member of this Government of National Unity, given that you were not consulted about this party joining the GNU?
We have to be consulted about it. And in fact, it's crucially important to point out the clause on the cabinet. It says, that's clause 17, whilst recognizing the president's prerogative to appoint members of the executive, such appointments should be done in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties of the members considered for appointment. So he can't just let anybody come in. He's got to consult with us, and then he makes the appointments in consultation with the leaders of the parties who have been accepted for admission into the Government of National Unity.
How extensive do you expect those consultations to be? Should he come to the DA and say, I've got 3 ministerial positions for you, this, and then consult you? Or do you expect him to say, okay, how do I constitute this government? And you as the DA give your own thoughts on which ministry you think should go to which individual or which political party?
Well, first of all, he can't come along to say we're going to give you 3 ministries, because he has to look at clause 16. Now, clause 16 says that it's a bit of a word salad, clause 16, because it was changed so often backwards and forwards, but it currently says, the Government of National Unity shall be constituted in a manner that reflects genuine inclusiveness of political parties that are party to the statement of intent and are represented in the National Assembly, broadly taking into account the number of seats parties have in the National Assembly and the need to advance the national interest. The President shall, in consulting the Executive, take into account the electoral outcomes. Now, if he takes into account the electoral outcomes of the parties that have already been admitted into the Government of National Unity by the processes that we've spoken about here, that means whatever the size of the cabinet, we're entitled to 30% of the seats, and the ANC is entitled to 60% of the seats.
Okay.
So you can't say here, well, I'm giving you 3. It doesn't work that doesn't work that way.
All right, so it has to constitute about 30%, which is what you are holding in the Government of National Unity. In numbers, just help our viewers understand, just to be practical in numbers, how many ministries are we talking here, based on how cabinet, how the executive is constituted at the moment?
Well, we don't know how big the cabinet is going to be. We want to reduce the size of the cabinet. So, of course, when you talk about how many seats we're going to get in the cabinet, it depends on how big this cabinet is. But however big the cabinet is, we should get about 30%.
So when you say you want to reduce the cabinet, what's your suggestion or recommendation to the president? What do you want to reduce it to?
Well, we haven't had discussions on that particular issue within the Democratic Alliance, but we think the current cabinet is too big.
Okay, so, all right. So that's one of the recommendations I suppose you're going to make to the president as he consults you as a member of the GNU.
Correct.
Okay. Have you as the Democratic Alliance spoken about which ministries you think you can best serve in? I know you've already indicated that it makes sense for John Steenhuisen, for instance, to be the minister in the presidency. What else are you thinking about?
Well, you see, Clement, if I go and say so now, I'm not the leader of the DA, as you know, and our leader, John Steenhuisen, has to have discussions with the president. And it would be very wrong for me to preempt, to undercut him in that conversation. He has to have a free hand, and I don't want to give advance notice or anything like that. It would probably undermine John's ability to have the critical discussion that we need to have. So yes, that is going forward, and I expect that conversation to happen very soon. The president's being inaugurated tomorrow, and it's going to be very, very important for that discussion to happen on a level playing field, and that's why I don't think I should preempt it.
Yeah, but as it stands, you still stand by not the decision, because it's not a decision of the DA, but you still stand by what you think as the DA would make sense, and that is that John Steenhuisen should be minister in the presidency. That's what you think would be fair, because you also didn't push for John Steenhuisen to be the deputy president.
Well, you know, we don't push hard for ceremonial positions or things like that. We don't do that. We want to get on with delivering our manifesto to the benefit of all South Africans. That's what we want to get on with. And we certainly will look at the cabinet positions in relation to our manifesto and the commitments we've made to the voters.
Okay, let me ask you then about the impeachment of the president. What agreement did you get into the ANC with when it comes to the impeachment or possible impeachment of President Cyril Ramaphosa? Should the Phala matter be resuscitated?
Clement, as I mentioned on the radio this week, we didn't actually discuss that issue in the negotiations at all, but there is nothing in this agreement, this GNU agreement, that would prevent us from participating in an impeachment process. The critical question is only if the evidence warrants it. So, for example, if very incriminating evidence, provable evidence, comes before Parliament, then we would have to take a decision based on the evidence. Because there is nothing in this document that says that we couldn't participate in impeachment processes if it was necessary to do so on the basis of the evidence. I indicated that to you in our last conversation, but we're not going to be doing votes of no confidence, and that is a different thing. Okay,
so when I spoke to you on the radio this week, you said that we won't vote to impeach the president that we voted for. This was part of the agreement with the ANC, unless, of course, there's new evidence of criminality on the president. So when you say this was part of the agreement with the ANC, that you wouldn't impeach him on Phala unless there's new evidence, what do you mean?
That isn't an agreement. The question that we're not going to do is votes of no confidence, but impeachment issues is a different matter. And if there's evidence of criminality, then obviously we've got to act. We can't just sit there and say, oh, we're not going to do it. And the government of national unity could still continue. That would be a political decision as to whether we wanted to break it or not in those circumstances.
What do you mean when you say it would continue?
Well, the government of national unity is not dependent on one individual. The ANC could vote to impeach the president and it wouldn't matter to the government of national unity specifically.
What would happen if the ANC, the president is impeached? Like, is there someone in the government of national unity who would have to take over? What does your clause say in your document?
The ANC would have to elect somebody to take the president's place.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it would probably be the deputy president who's there, at least in an interim basis.
Okay. So the Phala matter is now in court. There's a possibility that the courts may say that government failed to deal with this matter properly. If it comes back and then you are expected as Parliament, or Parliament is expected to then vote on that independent report by legal experts. As the Democratic Alliance, now that you are part of a government and you're no longer on the opposition benches, how do you vote? Do you vote because previously you voted in support of adopting that report? Does your position now change now you're in the GNU?
No, you'll remember that Judge Zondo said that Parliament must do its job in oversight of the executive. And the ANC needs to do it just as much as the DA needs to do it, just as much as any other party needs to do it. Because we have the separation of powers, the executive, the DA will be in the executive now, but we'll also have many, many members of Parliament and chairs of portfolio committees, and Parliament must do its job.
To be clear, though, the specific question I'm asking, Helen, is if that report comes back, the members of Parliament of the DA had voted to adopt that report so that there's a committee that is instituted where this matter of Phala Phala is dealt with. The ANC used its majority to push that down. Will you take the same position as the DA to say the report is now back, we would have voted this way in the beginning and we stand by that position now?
As you know, I'm not in Parliament, and I'm not the DA leader in Parliament, and I'm not the DA leader overall. My job is to manage the DA as a party. I'm like Fikile Mbalula, I am the Secretary-General of the DA. But unless there is strong evidence to suggest that we shouldn't adopt the position we adopted the first time round, I don't see us being likely to change our position.
Okay. DA Federal Executive Chair Helen Zille, thank you so much for your time on Face the Nation tonight. I really appreciate it.